Okay, hey guys. We're going to be covering depositional landforms over rivers. This is the one of two parts of the landforms of rivers. The second part will be the other landforms of rivers, and meanders isn't in this section, as although it's kind of a depositional feature, it's also caused by erosion. So I'm not going to be covering that in this particular segment. So let's get started. So what am I going to be covering? Why might deposition occur? So what's the things that's going to cause deposition to occur in a river system? And these are the landforms that I'm going to be covering: braiding, deltas, levees, and floodplains. So why might it occur? Now these are just some of the reasons. Weather would cause reduced discharge. So in times of drought, there's reduced precipitation in the river. There's just going to be less water entering the river. So it's going to reduce its discharge, and that means it has less energy. Why that's important, I'll explain in a second. Increases in friction. This is going to slow down the velocity of the river. Increases in friction could be when it exceeds bankfall. That's what happens when it floods. I'll cover flooding in another video, but basically when a flood occurs, a river's capacity, its discharge, exceeds its bankfall. And meeting slow bodies of moving water. And what this is an example of why deltas form, why deposition occurs, and why deltas form. Because slow moving bodies of water absorb the energy of the river, it slows it down. You don't see rapid tides at the coast. What this all has to do with is the Holstrom curve. Now I'm probably gonna cover this in another video, but just in case I don't, I'm just going to briefly explain it. Holstrom curve is basically a model of what happens to material in a river and downstream and upstream at different parts. It's nothing to do with downstream or upstream, just like what happens to it. This line here is the entrainment value, and it's the velocity required to pick up the material. So for example, for sand, a small piece of sand, 0.1, it would need to be travelling at 100 centimeters per second for it to be able to. It might need to be travelling further, but it has to be a minimum of 100 centimeters per second. Settling velocity is the velocity where the energy is too little to carry it anymore, so it's deposited. The river just lets go. How sediment travels through a river will also be covered in another video. Siltation, traction, solution, things like that. This bit here I'll just explain for anyone who doesn't know Holstrom curve. The reason this doesn't go straight down and this bit is slightly up, like near pebbles, even though clay's clearly tiny, is because clay is different. It's so small that the surface area of it provides no friction or contact for the river to pick it up. So it actually needs a very, very high velocity to pick it up. But then once it's picked up, it can be carried on for ages. And in fact, it doesn't actually get deposited until the river stops flowing. Now this could be when it reaches the sea or when it just dries up. So that's why deposition might occur. River braiding is the first depositional feature. Here I've got an example of river braiding. This is a river in India. I'm not going to try and pronounce it. And this is just a quick diagram. Now, what is river braiding? River braiding is these features here. And the reason they're caused is basically large amounts of sediment are transported in a river at certain times. And during these times, when the velocity of the river slows down, these sediments are deposited. Braiding normally occurs when there's a high discharge and big pieces of sediment, such as pebbles, sand, or even small boulders and rocks, are deposited. Eventually these build up over time, and these increase friction around that area, in the river channel, which also slows down the velocity even more, which contributes more deposited, and this builds up to eventually block the river channel. And the river attempts to find a new way through, an easier path, because water's always looking for the easiest path around. It doesn't want to force its way through. So river braiding is basically caused by a river. It's not like a meander bend when it's the hard rock. It's just the river's not got enough energy anymore and it has to drop its stuff. River braiding always comes back around and meets its same self. Anastomosing channels when it doesn't, but you don't really need to know that. So yeah, that's river braiding. Deltas. Okay, so deltas. So what are deltas? This is an example. This is the Nile, very famous delta. Brings fertile soil. What is it? It's when a river occurs to meet a slow moving body of water. It can occur at the sea, which is most of the famous ones, like the Mississippi River Delta and the Nile Delta, but it can also occur at lakes, such as in the Rocky Mountains. And basically, when it meets a slow moving body of water, its velocity slows down and the settlement value is reached. See, we're going back to the Holstrom curve here. Settlement value is reached, so material is deposited. This builds up on the seabed, and over time the alluvium is a good word to use here. Alluvium is just the material that's deposited, rises above the sea level and blocks the river mouth, which causes braiding to occur. Now there's three types. Arcuate, the Nile is an example of this, and they're basically determined by the shape. So you can see a convex, rounded shape of the Nile here. That's why it's an arcuate. This is the Mississippi Delta, and this is a bird's foot delta. As you can see, the sediments distributed around the different braided channels, anastomosing channels of the river. It's just many sediment bounded distributary channels, and it's usually in a fan type shape. Cuspate. I couldn't find a very good picture, so this is one I drew. It's basically when sediment's deposited evenly on either side, and it's normally quite a straight river channel that's entering the sea. Okay, so now we're getting to Oxbow Lakes. Now this is just a brief picture describing what happens in a meander. I will cover this in another video as I described earlier, but just in case, basically on the outer bit of a meander, erosion occurs, and on the inner bit, deposition occurs. Due to the different speeds, the river's not travelling at the same speed everywhere in it. It's travelling at different speeds at different parts of it. So basically, Oxbow Lakes are just developments of meanders, and the meander moves over time as erosion and deposition moves it. The neck of the meander loop becomes narrower because of the erosion occurring on the outside and the deposition occurring on the inside, causing it to move inwards towards each other. And eventually this becomes so narrow that probably during a time of flood, when there's high discharge and high erosion, it just is completely removed. And this leaves a much more efficient path for the river to take, because rivers want the easiest path, so they take that instead. This drastically reduces the velocity, so eventually deposition occurs, and this blocks off, dams off the Oxbow Lake. As there's no more input into the Oxbow Lake, it will eventually disappear, but some of them stay for a very long time because they're just huge. Some of them get very huge, like in the Amazon there's some very, very big ones. So it depends on the size and time. So it's going to take a very long time depending on the body of water, because it mainly disappears because of evaporation rather than deposition. But smaller ones could be filled up pretty quickly due to vegetation, as happened here in the Amazon. This is just because there's such huge amounts of trees which grow. Levees and floodplains are the final bit. Now when a flood occurs, it exceeds bankful, and what this means is the velocity of the river is drastically reduced because there's a much larger wetted perimeter. As said here, the hydraulic radius decreases. Again, I'll cover this in another video, but it's basically a measure of the efficiency based on frictional contact. So there's more surface area in contact, so that lowers the velocity, leading to deposition. The heaviest sediment is deposited first, and this builds up over time. And this is basically what the levee is, because it's on the banks of the river. What's cool about levees is it actually makes it harder for the river to flood because it builds up over time. As seen here, during flood, the sediment is deposited, and then it's raised this bank wall, so now it's harder for the river to flood. So as the river floods, these bits are in much higher surface area contact, so there's much greater frictional slowing down the water here compared to here. Floods, whoops, let me just fix that. Floods are basically the same. But it's much smaller sediment, sorry about this. The sediment deposited on the floodplains are much smaller. The shallow water has travelled quite a long way, so any of the heavier sediment would have already been deposited earlier, creating that levees. And it's this fine sediment that's deposited, and successive floods add to the alluvium, which is again the deposited material. And this material can include clay, which is why you find on floodplains, like around the Thames, huge amounts of clay, because it will just flood, and again, using the entrainment value, it's very difficult to pick it back up, especially in a floodplain, so it's just going to stay there. So yeah, that's basically the depositional features of rivers, or the depositional landforms of rivers. And in an exam, this could vary from questions to pictures, which you might have to describe and things like that. So hopefully this was helpful. If you've got any questions about things that you didn't understand, just post it in the comment and I'll try to answer it. So yeah, thanks for watching. See you next time.